The first lecture is dedicated to the early days of cinema in Poland, up to approximately 1918. This covers the period before Polish independence was restored. To start, I would like to address two stereotypes that often arise when discussing this early period. The first stereotype is that the lack of statehood resulted in Polish people being behind in terms of a sophisticated lifestyle, and that culture under the three reigning powers wasn't well coordinated. The second concerns the cheap, trashy or primitive nature of this early cinema. New cinema historians are particularly sensitive to the term trashy, meaning shoddy or second-rate. Even if that was the case, it would occur much later, and it was only one of many paths that the art of cinema pursued at the time. But it certainly does not apply when discussing early cinema. We were not behind in any way. Various areas of culture developed just as quickly as in other European capitals, especially those art forms that preceded cinema, such as photography, to mention Bazin's concept of cinema being animated photography. This was in use from the early days. In Poland, it was quite the same as everywhere. In the 1860s, photographers started taking their, by then, lighter equipment outdoors. Photography albums were being published. The 1870s and 80s brought the dawn of press photography. The 80s were also about the rise of amateur photography. Photo labs start providing services for these amateur photographers. The public is by now used to subscribing photo series. Photo labs would mail a photo series to its subscribers. A series about volcanoes, for example, or European capital cities, or waterfalls, etc.
To jest przykład, jak w sposób naturalny to przekształciło się.
This is a good example of how this trend later naturally transformed into cinema. We followed a similar path. If we were to discuss comic strips, or theatre, or magazines, or illustrated weeklies, often about geography or travel, these developments were also in line with European trends. That's one.
To po pierwsze. Po drugie, co ważne, bardzo.
The second extremely important factor was that cinema addressed a certain need of civilization, one that had to do with the curiosity of the world. The age of the rise of cinema, 1895, is a period of incredible advancement of technology. Inventions such as the automobile, the velocipede, and the pathophone were created almost simultaneously. Even the word for the latter derives from Pathé, the name of its French manufacturer who had great achievements in creating the phonograph, but also in the development of the cinematograph. But when I mention airplanes, bicycles, automobiles, I am, of course, talking about transportation. I won't even bring up trains, because the development of railway networks covered the whole second half of the 19th century, or telephones too. The facilitation of communication that has a lot to do with mobility and curiosity of the outside world. Cinema was seen as a method of viewing the outside world. It could be argued that Sienkiewicz was the best Polish screenwriter. Not literally, of course, but as a creator of epic plots. I must confess, when I tried to reread those great historical novels recently, I could not get through them. They're not easy to read these days, at least for adults.
kłopoty. Natomiast sięganie do
But reading the works
książek
Sienkiewicz wrote as a reporter, journalist, is another story. His portrait of America is a fantastic read. It's what he wrote in his early years, in the 1870s. A young, enterprising traveler with a knack for compelling storytelling. In its early days, cinema referenced this reporter, this storyteller, and many others like him who told stories about the world. The early films address this type of curiosity. If there was any area in which Poland was behind, even if only by a few months or up to a year, in terms of inventions from around the world being introduced into Polish culture, it would be the area of the first cinema screenings. Cinema is usually the domain of the capital cities around the world. Not in the United States, obviously, but certainly in Europe. The film industry is centered around the capital city. Theaters, actors, producers, etc., that's where they're based. At the time, Warsaw was merely a provincial town under Russian administration. This proved to be a problem when the first screenings of the Lumière brothers' cinematograph, or should I say Louis Lumiere's cinématographie, he was the one to invent it, as we know, his brother August merely tagged along, since they had an agreement that they would do everything together. Inseparable brothers that they were. These inventors of the cinematograph from Lyon held the first triumphant screening in Paris in December 1895. That marks the beginning of cinema. The official date being December the 28th, 1895. The first ever cinema screening with paid admission. They then began sending representatives of their Lyon-based company out into the world, with a double purpose. First, to have these quickly trained operators organize screenings in various European cities, starting with capital cities, as a form of advertising. In order to prove that this is an invention above all others, beating even Edison. The successful screening in the United States in June 1896 sealed the deal as far as the global success of the Lumière brothers' cinematograph was concerned. But the second goal, while they were in these locations, was to film, collect new footage. At the time, they were short, location-based, 50-second-long films shot on tape. The Lumière's archive was quickly expanding. When the Lumière's representative, Mariusz Chapuis, arrived in Warsaw in April 1896, several months after the first rush, which is well documented because the Lumière brothers have a cult following among the French, their biography has been thoroughly researched. He spent 2 weeks trying to reach out to Warsaw bureaucrats, but he wasn't able to seal any deals. He would make plans to meet with an official who would then fail to show up, or it was someone's name day. Having had absolutely no success in 2 weeks, he went on to St. Petersburg. Warsaw was merely a stop on his way, and at that time, the first show of the Lumière brothers' cinematograph in Poland did not take place. It wasn't until November, in the much better organized and more punctual region of Galicia, that the first screening of the Lumière's cinematograph in Poland was held on November the 14th, 1896. That makes it 11 months after the premiere screening. This was a lot. By then we were with the likes of Honduras and Colombia. In Europe, screenings everywhere had been held earlier. What's interesting is that the screening took place inside the City Theatre, known today as the Słowacki Theatre, one of the most beautiful theatre edifices in Poland.
Dyrektorem tego teatru był Tadeusz Pawlikowski.
At the time, the director of the theatre was Tadeusz Pawlikowski. There is now a street in the center of Krakow named after him, a remarkable man. He was a well-educated individual who did not fear the secularization of the theatre. It was easy to imagine films screening at the theatre.
W teatrze, więc ten pierwszy pokaz się odbył.
So this initial screening had a running time of under 20 minutes.
Pierwszym było śniadanie dziecka.
It was 12 short films. The first was a child's breakfast, or lunch more likely, since there's cognac on the table. Déjeuner means lunch, so a child's
Na
lunch.
koniec słynny
By the famous arrival of the train at the train station.
Andrzej Urbańczyk, nieżyjący już dziś polityk, ale też świetny historyk.
The late Andrzej Urbańczyk, politician but also acclaimed historian of early cinema, once published a book about those first screenings, in which he calculated that over several weeks, because the screenings were repeated a number of times, 10,000 people of Krakow saw a screening of the cinematograph. Considering that Krakow had a population of about 80,000 at the time, that means 1 in 8 Krakow residents went to a screening in the first weeks. So this quickly became a form of entertainment, a cultural phenomenon. It was treated as an invention, a window to the world, a mass phenomenon.
Zjawisko masowe. Wszyscy tym byli zainteresowani.
Everyone was interested. A few months later, in early 1897, when similar screenings were being held at the Skarbek Theatre in Lvov, the number of town residents who went to these screenings was up to 1 in 5, according to calculations by Barbara Gierszewska. And even more people would join in later. There were no cinemas at the time, but various venues would be adapted for the purpose of these screenings. Cinema was growing fast, gradually introducing new shows. But what was both important and interesting was the content being shown to the public, the early days of film production.
Jak zaczynała się produkcja filmowa. Tu jest takie określenie pionierzy.
The term pioneers is popular in this context. Every culture has its pioneers of cinema.
Tu też jest rzecz charakterystyczna. Taka może najciekawsza, najmocniej obecna w światowej historiografii.
One interesting fact on that note is that the most acclaimed Polish pioneer in this area was Bolesław Matuszewski, who, and this was quite unique about the Polish pioneer, was a photographer.
On był fotografem, jak zawsze, prawda? Zwykle ci pierwsi wynalazcy
Of course, many of the early inventors started with photography and moved into animated photography. He was a member of the intelligentsia, living between Warsaw and Paris, where he had his own photography studio.
I on w tym Paryżu w latach 90.
In Paris, in the 1890s, he was particularly interested in the archive potential and qualities of photography.
Możliwościami i właściwościami fotografii. I jak zobaczył kino,
When he first saw the cinematograph, learned how to operate it, and started making those first short films using the Lumière technique,
limierowską, to zorientował się, że film jest nowym,
he realized that film was a newer, better, and more reliable historical source than its predecessors, or at least so it seemed at the time.
I opublikował w 1800.
In 1898, he published a book in Paris called Une nouvelle source de l'histoire, a new source of history.
Która właściwie była takim pierwszym opracowaniem.
This was the first historical or theoretical treatise on the possibilities offered by cinema.
On potem zaraz opublikował jej drugą
He quickly published a second edition as the book became widely debated.
I można powiedzieć, że podtytuł jest takie dépôt.
It has a subtitle of Dépôt historique, which roughly translates into cinematographic repository. But in fact, it's more of an archive.
I on już w 3 lata po powstaniu kina
Less than 3 years after the invention of the medium, he offered an understanding of cinema that suggested that archives could be made of film footage in all areas.
filmowych, dotyczące wszystkich dziedzin.
From maritime battles, diplomatic sessions, surgeries. That was the trend at the time, filming surgeries.
To było wtedy modne. Filmowanie operacji, instrukcje obsługi maszyn,
Instruction manuals, the work of a conductor,
rejestracja przedstawień teatralnych, aż po
recording stage plays to his own memoirs, as was visible already in his early works.
Wtedy on wpadł na to, że niedługo, to się sprawdziło po latach, ale dziś się sprawdza.
It proved useful years later, and is certainly functional today, that everyone can have access to equipment that is easy to handle in order to film their lives.
Filmować cały czas swoje życie. Ale to jest późniejszy problem.
Whether anyone is going to watch our lives on film is another story, but that's a problem that arises later. What's important is that this Polish pioneer was the first to recognize the documentary and archive properties of cinema. There were, of course, other inventors, like Kazimierz Pruszyński, a Liège-educated engineer, who quickly came up with an invention of his own in the world of cinema. He called it the pleiograph. This was quite often the case. The English, the Russians, the Germans, the Składanovsky brothers, every country had its own inventors, who, as it turned out, lost the race to the Lumière brothers, yet found ways of improving on their inventions. For instance, Pruszyński went on to invent the aeroscope, the world's first camera that could be used for aerial photography, which was later used in World War I. His later idée fixe was to manufacture an easy-to-use amateur camera. He established a company called Oko for that very purpose. Throughout the interwar period, he tried to get this lightweight camera into mass production. But it was of crucial importance to him that the camera be affordable, not regarded as a luxury product. And that's what made him lose this competition. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to the early days of cinema. Other such pioneers, not of the cinema as an object, but of the art of exhibition, were the Krzemiński brothers from central Poland. The elder brother was born in Radom. The brothers established the first stationary cinema in Łódź in December 1899. It would usually operate for about 3 months. Then they'd set off on a tour of Russia with the cinematograph screenings. They eventually returned to Poland, settled down, and began opening stationary cinemas. One crucial fact: the stabilization of cinema as an institution, still referred to at the time as kinoteatr or iluzjon, depending on the region, the word kino for cinema didn't become common use until after 1918.
Do języka już po odzyskaniu niepodległości upowszechniło się jako ujednolicone określenie. Więc stabilizacja kina.
So, this stabilization of cinema took place around 1907 to 1908, when a certain arrangement came into play, at first seemingly purely technical. Film tape, which in the early days was purchased by the exhibitors, was now to be rented. Once the cinema owners started renting the reels, they took better care of them, since they then had to be forwarded to another exhibitor. This facilitated the circulation of film reels, and it went along with the development of technology and longer screenings. In the early days, a film screening was set at about 1 hour, 50 minutes of which was film footage, made up of a series of short films from various genres. A bit of documentaries from around the world to start, then some early genre movies, a short horror, a short comedy, especially comedy scenes.
Wraz z wydłużeniem seansu
Once the screenings became longer, up to about 2 hours with Griffith's Birth of a Nation, a running time of 1 hour 40 or 1 hour 50 minutes proved to be ideal. But that came later.
do dziś, że to jest idealna długość seansu, ale to przyszło potem. Te dłuższe seanse...
These longer screenings of 40 to 50 minutes and up to a few hours, that's all taking place around the time of 1909 to 1911.
Zmienia się charakter kina, stopniowo
The nature of cinema changes. What used to be mostly about dazzling audiences with short ideas transformed into a closed screening that was more about having the audience glued to the screen for those 1.5 to 2 hours, immersed in the story, forgetting about the outside world,
ekranu do akcji, zapomina o sobie, zapomina o Bożym świecie,
becoming the little girl, the cowboy. Maybe not the Indian, because the Indians in those days would always get shot.
Zawsze tu jesteśmy, Indianie to w tych wczesnych filmach tylko są zastrzeliwani bezszmerowo. Około 1910, 11, 12 powstają pierwsze budynki filmowe.
The first cinema venues were built around 1910 to 1912. A good example of this is Krakow.
Dobrze opracowane. Pierwsze stałe kino w Krakowie.
The first stationary cinema opened in 1906. It was called Cyrk Odeon and opened in an old circus with a seating capacity of 1,500. It was this old wooden circus.
Drewnianej budzie cyrkowej przy ulicy Wielopole. Właścicielem tego cyrku Odeon był wcześniej zegarmistrz, właściciel zakładu zegarmistrzowskiego.
The circus was previously owned by a watchmaker named Józef Kleinberger. For several years, it was the largest cinema in Krakow. Interestingly enough, it was located at Wielopole, a street between the working-class districts of Grzegórzki and Podgórze, and the noble city centre with its university, theatres, etc. Cinema was the in-between, but it was certainly tied to the life of the city.
Zresztą bardzo ciekawie związane z życiem miasta. Na przykład premiera...
For instance, the premiere of the French film The Hunchback of Notre Dame, based on the famous novel by Victor Hugo, was regarded as anti-Christian. It was linked to a student protest against the rejection of secularization of universities, which, along with the traditionally strong Christian lobby in Krakow, marked the beginning of the end of this cinema. It burned down in 1912, was then closed, and never reopened.
Które spłonęło, zostało zamknięte, już nie wróciło do działania w 1912 roku. Ale w tym samym 1912 roku, jesienią, powstały dwie piękne...
But in the fall of that same year, 1912, two other beautiful cinemas opened. First, Kino Wanda, located nearby at Gertrudy Street. Then Kino Uciecha at Starowiślna, even more beautiful, gorgeously decorated by Krakow-based painter Henryk Uziębło. I myself remember going to that cinema. I watched High Noon at Kino Uciecha. Both of these cinemas operated until about a dozen years ago. Today, Kino Wanda is a supermarket. As is often the case in culture, that spot was filled by multiplex cinemas. In Krakow, these cinemas were elegant venues in the city centre, and they started competing with one another. Film life intensified quickly. Exhibitors would come up with new ideas. If one cinema was showing a week of films featuring Asta Nielsen, the other would show a week of films with Max Linder. They started printing programs, and by 1914 there were 8 cinemas in the centre of Krakow. Over one decade, this turned into a key cultural phenomenon. People started getting used to their chosen cinema. It is said that by 1914, the average resident of a major city would see a film about once a week. It turned into a habit.
było stałe przyzwyczajenie. No i teraz wracamy do pytania, co w
And
tych
that
kinach
brings us back to the question of what was actually screened at these
Właśnie ci
cinemas.
kiniarze, właściciele bądź najemcy sal kinowych, no raczej właściciele, bo majętniejsi byli, w tych latach
For the cinema owners,
zaczynali
it was
w sposób
often
naturalny
natural to start producing their own content.
to, co mieli pokazywać. Zaczynało się od aktualności.
It began
To
with
było
newsreels.
najłatwiejsze
They were the easiest to produce.
do realizacji, pokazy, jakieś nowości ze swojego miasta.
News from the life of the
Ten
city.
przykład, o którym mówiłem, Józef Kleinberger.
I mentioned
właściciel
Kleinberger,
cyrku Odeon.
the owner of
On został
Cirque
też
Odeon.
producentem
He became a
filmowym,
producer
producentem,
and made films about current events.
aktualności. W 1907 roku zmarł Stanisław
When Stanisław Wyspiański passed away in 1907, Kleinberger convinced Krakow mayor Juliusz Leo that this was a newsworthy event.
News, że warto spróbować utrwalić na taśmie filmowej takie zdarzenie jak pogrzeb Wyspiańskiego, wielki artysta. On się mógł
He thought it would be
spodziewać, że
worthwhile to film the funeral of Wyspiański,
jeden z
a great
numerów
artist.
takich, które
He had reason to believe that it would be easy to sell or exchange with exhibitors from other major European cities, especially Vienna or Berlin, Vienna being the national capital for Galicia at the time.
no, z Wiedniem, tu mówię o stolicy, prawda, dla Galicji. No i tak się właśnie działo, że ci kiniarze zaczęli sami być producentami, łatwiej
That's what happened. The exhibitors turned into producers. That made it easier for them to acquire interesting films from their European partners.
z branży. No ale tu już stopniowo Warszawa dochodzi do głosu.
And then the rise of
Pierwszy
Warsaw
taki
began.
producent na dużą
The first
europejską
major film
skalę
producer was based in Warsaw.
pojawił się jednak w Warszawie. To był
It was Alexander Hertz, a Jewish-born intellectual from the renowned Hertz family, which was known for its great contribution to Polish culture. His namesake, Alexander Hertz, historian, or the fairy tale writer, Benedict Hertz. The list goes on.
Hertz, no można by wymieniać długo.
Alexander Hertz was a member of the Socialist Party. He had taken part in the 1905 revolution. He was sentenced and forced to leave the country.
1905 roku dostał wyrok, musiał wyjechać za granicę, a jak wrócił, to już nie wrócił.
When
do
he returned, he no longer engaged in political activism, but instead turned to cinema and became Poland's first major film producer.
Na dużą skalę, założone przez niego w 1909 roku.
The Sphinx Company, which he established in 1909, operated at 116 Marszałkowska Street, which was also the location of their own cinema.
No, to był właśnie
This
ten
marked the
początek
beginning of a
porządnego
decent Polish film industry.
polskiego przemysłu kinematograficznego. On najpierw realizował
At first, Hertz produced newsreels, like all exhibitors, but he gradually moved into producing feature films.
przeszedł do
In 1911, the year that the first few feature-length films were produced, Hertz produced Mayor Ezofowicz, based on a novel by Eliza Orzeszkowa.
pierwszych, no, na ówczesne zwyczaje filmów pełnometrażowych. Zrealizował film Meyer Ezofowicz, adaptację powieści Elizy Orzeszkowej. Rzecz charakterystyczna, że właśnie ta opowieść o emancypacji polskich Żydów.
What's interesting is that this story about the emancipation of Polish Jews aimed at encouraging them to get out of their ghettos, to become Polonized, to engage in the local culture, that this was the first Sphinx production, but it was not the first Polish
Ale nie
feature
jest to
film.
pierwszy film polski, fabularny. Jeśli nie liczyć krótkich, takich dwuminutowych filmików Kazimierza Pruszyńskiego, wspomnianego, wcześniejszych jeszcze z 1902 roku.
Not counting the short 2-minute films made by Kazimierz Pruszyński back in 1902, the first Polish feature film, slightly longer, at about 8 minutes, which has been found and can still be seen today, is the film Pruska Kultura, Prussian Culture, made in 1908.
Związany z Poznaniem, choć producentem był Moshe Towbin. To właśnie wydaje mi się ładne i eleganckie, że
It was produced by Moshe Tovbin. It seems to me quite nice and elegant that the first Polish feature film was produced by the same Mojżesz Tovbin who catered to the Jewish audience in Warsaw. The audience who spoke Yiddish and with Yiddish intertitles. But his first film was Polish, with Polish intertitles, and meant for a Polish audience.
Tytuł Pruska kultura jest mylący. Może lepiej to wyczuli Francuzi.
The title is a bit misleading. The French translation is better. Les Martyrs de la Pologne, The Martyrs of Poland.
Ten film nawiązywał do konsekwencji rewolucji 1905 roku.
This film is focused on the consequences of the 1905 revolution, the famous children's strike against the Germanization in Września. It consisted of 8 episodes, as was usual at the time, an 8-minute film that, incidentally, had a lot of trouble with censorship in Poland. For years, it was considered to be lost. Luckily, it was found recently. Today, it is a respected cinema relic that serves as proof of the high quality of film culture in Poland at the time.
Jednak późniejsze, aż do 1918 roku, ważniejsze osiągnięcia w dziedzinie filmu fabularnego łączą się właśnie ze wspomnianą.
Later successes, up to 1918 that is, were mostly produced by Sphinx, so they were films by Alexander Herz. Adding the director's name was a later trend. It wasn't common back in the day.
Nie stosowało się tego wcześniej. Film to film, jeśli dodawano coś do tytułu.
A film was a film. If anyone got top billing, it would be the star, or the producer, the genre. The director didn't seem as important, so at the time they usually remained anonymous.
To były raczej postaci anonimowe. Jeśli już, to właśnie producent Alexander Herz był ważną postacią.
It was producer Alexander Herz who was important enough. It is said that he practically directed all his films, although his name would rarely appear on the bill as director.
Funkcji reżysera. Sphinx też odkrył pierwszą polską.
Sphinx also discovered Poland's first film star. It was, of course, Pola Negri. Her real name was Apollonia Chałupiec. She got her stage name from the Italian poet Ada Negri. She was already using the name of Pola Negri in her teens when she began a career in Warsaw theatres. It was there that she was noticed by filmmakers, and from 1914 onwards, she would star in Sphinx movies, from the tender age of 17.
Stworzyła taki typ, znany w kulturze femme fatale, właściwie dziewczyny fatalnej.
She would usually play the archetypical femme fatale, possibly because she bloomed early. But when she played these young women, dark-haired and dark-eyed, vivacious with impeccable mimic skills, a true star of silent cinema didn't need to have a good voice. The key factors were beauty and expression. She had a lot of both.
Ona dysponowała tym w ogromnym stopniu. Także ona też była tą pierwszą polską aktorką, która zrobiła pracę.
So she was the first Polish actress to have a truly international career. First in Germany, starring in films by Lubitsch, then in Hollywood.
Ale zanim do tego doszło, to przez kilka lat.
But before that happened, she was the star of Sphinx for a few years, playing very similar roles, such as in Bestia, the Polish dancer. One of the few films that still exist today, she played a young, deceitful, vivacious girl who fell victim to her beloved.
Młodą, pełną temperamentu dziewczynę, która stawała się ofiarą swojego ukochanego. zwłaszcza po 1915 roku, po odejściu, wygnaniu Rosjan z Warszawy, kiedy na krótko, na 3 lata...
After 1915, when the Russians were banished from Warsaw and the city administration was taken over by Germans for 3 years, and anti-Russian sentiments were ripe in the city, Sphinx dominated film production in Warsaw and produced an entire series of films.
Produkował całą serię takich filmów. Ochrana warszawska i jej tajemnice.
Ochrana Warszawska i jej tajemnice, The Secrets of the Warsaw Police, the 1916 hit movie with a meaningful title. The premise was always similar. An evil Russian, usually played by Kazimierz Junosza-Stempowski. Hertz was good at spotting acting talent. He had signed contracts with the best actors by then. Paula Negri did not play the female lead in this film.
Głównej roli kobiecej. W każdym razie tego rodzaju antyrosyjskie fabuły
This type of anti-Russian feature with an evil Russian seducing a Polish girl who could later be rescued by a Polish patriot,
polski patriota, w tym wypadku
in this case it was Józef Węgrzyn who played that patriot, these films would come one after another. Carska Faworyta, The Tsar's Favorite, etc. But by 1918, when these films returned to the screen, critics began to complain. Enough already. We're an independent nation now. We need new, more ludic features.